Chapter 2, we're going to talk about incivility, a little bit about what that is, and also below and above the line behaviors. A lot of us have heard of that concept, so that's totally fine, but I want to dig just one step deeper into it compared to what we're often given by generic HR training. And I really want to talk about what that actually means to have high levels of EQ when it comes to above and below the line behaviors. So, what is incivility? You might have heard the term being bandied around. And to put it colloquially, it's just people being a little bit rude, a little bit passive aggressive, usually it comes out as. It's those things that don't quite class as wrong. They're not things that you can performance manage somebody on the fact that, swearing or telling a sexist or racist joke. They're clearly things that you can say that was not okay in the workplace. Incivility tends to be much harder to have a black and white line because, again, you go back to those manuals before, everyone sits ever so slightly differently. And so incivility, some of the classic things you see are things like snappiness, things like eye rolling, gossip, things like what I call the meeting after the meeting, where they all kind of agree with you or what the team leader says in the meeting, and then they go and talk about it behind their leader's back afterwards about how they all disagree with the idea. It's things like passive aggressiveness or okay, fines, or making snide little comments under your breath, muttering. So it's the sort of things that are really challenging to outright say you did X, because they can be like, oh no, I didn't mean it that way. Or they're much harder in a workplace to just black and white say we do not allow this. Okay, we're getting better at it. We're getting a lot better at we do not allow gossiping, for example. But there's always still people who can go, oh, well, we weren't gossiping. We were worried about her, so we were planning what we could do. Or, I wasn't sighing because it was being passive aggressive. I was sighing because I'm feeling sad. There's always something that people can say and do to kind of go, oh, no, well. But incivility put into one bucket is those things that are hard to define, sometimes hard to spot, but they slowly erode culture. They make people feel less safe. They make people feel, if somebody rolls their eyes at you, how do you feel about that? If you found out that people were gossiping about you, how does that feel? Or even, in fact, if you're in a room of being included in the gossiping, if you think too hard about that, then you have to realize that if they're going to gossip in this scenario, they're gossiping about you too. So none of these things lead to people feeling safe, people feeling included, and people feeling fulfilled. And they're a really big burden on our resilience and well-being. So one of the most popular models to talk about incivility is we talk about above and below the line behaviors. Okay, it's not rocket science to work out what that means. It's effectively things that are below the line, think of a bit below the belt. Okay, so it's your negative framed behaviors. It is the eye rolling and the gossip and the unprofessionalism and the, not talking to the person directly, but talking in triangles. It's the passive aggressive approach. It's the being frustrated and picking flaws in somebody's strategy. Whereas, of course, above the line behaviors won't come as any surprise, effectively means the opposite of that. It means trying to work on solutions, trying to find ways forward, trying to be part of, championing things. Okay. And this is regularly talked about in, standard HR kind of generic training, and it's good stuff. Like, there's nothing wrong with above and below the line behaviors, but I believe that there's some missing components to it, and I just want to dig a tiny bit into that to really try to reframe it back to tie into the emotional intelligence piece before, and the why this matters when I'm talking about resilience and well-being, and you're sitting there going, well, what does it matter to you if I'm feeling off and I'm passive aggressive or snappy? Like, I want to tie this back to why this is actually about your own personal fulfillment, right? So to give you the breakdown, when we talk about above the line and below the line, they use the acronym ORBED, which is a pretty terrible acronym because it means nothing to anybody. But to be above the line is the OR. So ownership, accountability, and responsibility, okay? Somebody who is behaving with ownership, with accountability and responsibility is considered to be above the line. Somebody who is using denial, excuses, and blame, BED, are considered to be acting below the line. Now, some of that seems quite obvious, right? Like being in denial, using excuses, blaming others. In theory, like we kind of know what that looks like until we're in the thick of it and we don't. Okay, that's when we're kind of like, oh no, it wasn't an excuse, it was a reason. Or I'm not denying it, I just want to tell you that that's not really how it happened. Or I'm not blaming the other person, but equally, it's not my fault. So we don't tend to see these things when we are the person doing them. And equally, above the line, what does accountability and ownership for a situation mean? So I think that it's a little bit unhelpful in terms of, well, what does that look like? Am I being above or below the line, right? So I like to break it down a little bit. If we're considering that ownership, accountability, and responsibility are your thoughts that are going on, all right? When we dig a little bit into feelings, okay, because remember that our thoughts can create our feelings, all right? We are usually feeling curious, optimistic, and in control when we are having thoughts that sound like ownership, accountability, and responsibility, right? When we are having thoughts or feelings that sound like denial, excuses, and blame, that usually triggers something in your head which is easier to objectively identify, you saying it out loud especially. Judgment, fear or uncertainty, defensiveness, or closed off. Okay, so if you're feeling those feelings, the likelihood is that you're coming from a place of denial and excuses and blame. And so this is where we want to start talking about, well, what does that mean? How's that on me? Why does that matter? Okay. But symptoms that you'll look for, what you really see when people are above the line, you're going to see people who ask questions, you're going to see people who ask for feedback, even when it's uncomfortable. They're going to go out of their way to seek it. You're going to have people who are seeking ideas. They're looking for opportunities to solve problems. They're asking other people about their perspectives on a scenario. They're speaking to people who might actually know the right information rather than gossiping about it belowhand. And they're focusing their energy on the things that they can control. All right. Whereas people who are below the line, you'll see things like they're ignoring a problem or they're reacting to a problem. Reacting tends to be a symptom of that low application of your emotional intelligence. So when you're being snappy or short-tempered, talking down to people, you're gossiping, you're passive-aggressive, or you're complaining to the people who aren't in a position to do anything about it. But the really key to me, the single biggest symptom that differentiates whether you are acting and thinking and feeling below or above the line, and therefore the outcomes we're going to get out of it, is whether you are committed to learning above the line or committed to being right, which is below the line. So when you are in a situation where you believe you're being above the line and somebody maybe challenges you on it, that is the single best question you can try to self-reflect on. Am I just wanting to be right? Am I sure that I'm right? And if you are sure that you are right, you are probably not. Because the truth is, the only way to be really genuinely acting in a way that is curious and problem-solving centered is to be open to learning more. That maybe you're partly right. Maybe you're both right. Maybe you're flat out wrong. Who knows? But ultimately, if you are committed to being right, you're usually behaving in a way that is below the line. All right. And the real reason that I want to talk about this is, you've got your thoughts, you've got your feelings, you've got your symptoms of what's happening that probably means you're acting that way. But the reason that this comes back to well-being is because how you are thinking and how you are feeling and how you are behaving directly impacts the outcomes that you get. And so if we are seeking fulfillment and growth and well-being and resilience, and we are stuck behaving in a way that is committed to being right and using excuses and feeling judgment and uncertainty, we're not likely to get outcomes that move us forward. Right? Whereas if we are in a position to be going, I don't know all of the information, I'm committed to learning more, I believe that there could be a pathway forward, I want to ask people questions, I want to seek more information, that is a person who is going to get the outcomes. Maybe not the exact outcomes you thought you were looking for, but you're going to get progress. And that is where you're going to find fulfillment and reduce your frustration. So people who behave above the line are consistently people who get the results. They take action, they find the solution, and they make choices that move them forward, as opposed to people who consistently are below the line. Often they procrastinate, they react, they wait for others to fix a problem, and therefore they stay stuck. They stay where they are and things don't move forward. And remember, in our last session, we talked about hope. And if you can't see ways forward, you don't have hope, then your resilience is going to suffer for that. And this is why it is so important to really be taking into account right at the beginning of a process, what is going on in our heads? What is creating the feelings that we're having? Because if we are then turning those feelings and thoughts into symptoms and behaving in a certain way and clinging to a certain being rightness, then that's unfortunately likely to create the outcomes we're going to get from this scenario. So, you want to know where is the line? This whole imaginary below and above the belt stuff? What's the belt, right? Well, here's some questions for you. Is it's my personality a reason to behave below the line? Probably not. No, right? We've all heard people say this, oh, it's just who I am. I can't help being blunt. Honestly, if you are coming from a level of initiating your emotional intelligence, bluntness is fine. I am notorious for not standing on many ceremonies, but it is still your responsibility to acknowledge that other people have a manual about whether or not that's inappropriate and whether or not that bubble that they've got around them tells them that what you said was hurtful or too brash or too blunt. And that's on you, not them, which many of us don't want to be true. We want to be allowed to bring our full selves to work. And you are allowed to bring your full self to work until it hurts others. What about being in a hurry? Oh, I was just such a snappy. I just needed help. I didn't snap at her. I just said it quickly. All right. We have a lot of emergencies in our profession. Okay. Yeah. Some of us do react. Some of us are in the thick of, trying to do resus on a patient or do 20 million things at once. And we do get snappy. The reality is that might happen. But you have a responsibility to acknowledge that you slipped below the line, and to head back above the line again requires you taking accountability and ownership and responsibility for that decision and working out what needs to be done to correct it. Yeah. We slip. We all slip. Nobody's perfect. Nobody's never snappy. But to get yourself above the line is those three things. Orbed, remember? Ownership, accountability, and responsibility. So take those things about whatever you did because you were in a hurry and you did snap and do something with it. All right. What about, I've already told her 1,000,000 times, so this time I yelled. I use this one a lot on my toddler. You shouted at me. I only shouted because I asked you nicely like 18 times and you didn't do it. I'm right, okay? But she is also right. I did shout at her. So ultimately, we've got a responsibility to go, yeah, it wasn't above the line. Whether or not it was appropriate or not, many of us question with our toddlers. But in a workplace, it's never appropriate, even if you had asked them 1,000,000 times. What about she's a manager, so I should be allowed to, talk to her like that because it's her job to hear hard truths? Really common one. I work with a lot of managers who are burnt out and frustrated and absolutely giving their heart and souls to roles where people just assume that they don't have feelings and throw things in their face. So I'm just going to answer that question for you. No, it's not a reason to go below the line. You need to treat your managers like every other human being in your workplace. Okay. And the same, by now, you know the answer to these questions. I was having a bad day. Is that a reason to go below the line? Something is going on in your personal life. You snapped in your professional life. It happens. Again, let's be clear. Nobody here has never slipped below the line. It happens. All right. But if we are using that as an excuse or thing to blame, remember, blame, excuses, and denial are the below the line thought processes. So it's fine. I'm not saying never do it and that you should beat yourself up through the ends of the earth because occasionally you mess this stuff up. It's just to get back above the line, you have to engage the ownership, accountability, responsibility and do something with that. Usually that's as simple as apologizing. But it's still on you to do it.